If you don't understand how to properly utilize compression in your mixes, this video is for you. I feel like a lot of new producers fall into the same trap where they end up adding compression to everything without fully understanding what each of the parameters do and how changing it affects the sound. I'm going to show you in a more visual way what all of the different parameters do so you can know what to listen out for, and it's going to drastically improve your mixes. So I've got a drum loop here. It's just one that I took off Splice. But if you look at what the waveform actually looks like, you've got these big hits, which is your kick and your snare, and then in between them, you've got these little hi-hat hits, right? So now if I go over to this very professional looking graph that I did earlier, this demonstrates the same thing, right? That's your waveform. You've got this big hits, your kick, that's your snare. In between, you've got these little hi-hat hits. And on this axis, it's amplitude, which relates to volume. And then on this axis, it's time. So in the case of the kick, for example, the initial transient, that initial hit, is very loud. And then it has kind of a tail. These hi-hats are just little. And then the snare is kind of the same, right? So now let's add some compression. If I go back to this, I'm just using the stock Logic compressor to demonstrate this. I start playing, and then when the threshold's at 0, it's not compressing at all. And then as I'm pulling it back, you'll start to see that meter move, and that means that the compressor is working. But the way of visualizing that, you can imagine the threshold is this yellow line here, and as I'm pulling back on the knob, you're pulling this line down until eventually the waveform crosses over that threshold, and that's when the compressor starts actually working. The waveform that goes above that imaginary line is what gets compressed. So whereas before the waveform looked like this red shape here, once the compressor takes effect, it might look more like this. Right, you can see that the level above the threshold has been reduced, but then below the threshold, it's exactly the same. So none of these hi-hats are getting compressed at the minute based on where that threshold is. That brings us on to ratio. So ratio is the amount that the signal gets reduced once it gets over that compression threshold. So if I have a ratio of 2 to 1, that means that for every 2 decibels above the threshold, it lets 1 through. Or in other words, it lets half of the signal through that goes above the threshold. So that's similar to what this graph is showing. That would probably be about a 2 to 1 ratio. And then as you increase it, it's letting less and less of that signal through once it goes above the threshold. So it's more strictly compressing it. So a 5 to 1, that would mean for every 5 dBs, 1 dB gets through. Or in other words, 1/5 of the signal above the threshold gets through. So if I start adding some compression now, just to demonstrate this, I'll start pulling back on the threshold until we're getting quite a lot of gain reduction. I'm on a 5 to 1 ratio for this. And now that's obviously very extreme. I'm getting like up to minus 20 dBs of gain reduction, just so you can hear the difference. Now you've probably noticed it sounds much quieter, and that's because the compressor is squashing the transients of that kick and the snare. Those initial hits are getting squashed, which makes the overall signal quieter. So now that's where we add the makeup gain. That literally is just increasing the overall level that's going out of the compressor so that we can match it with what the level was like before, which allows you to compare the before and after much better. So if you look at the level here, when I turn it on, you want it to be roughly the same so that you can hear what the compressor's doing more accurately. So now if I turn it, this is with the compressor on, now if I turn it off, you can hear how much louder that kick and the snare is compared to when I turn it on. Much quieter, but then that allows you to hear the hi-hats more, because after squashing the kick and the snare, we've raised the whole level up. So in relative terms, the hi-hat sounds louder. Okay, so now we'll go on to attack and release. Attack is how quickly after the waveform goes over that threshold, the compression takes place. So if I get rid of this, if you imagine this purple line is the attack, as it currently stands, we've got it on 2 milliseconds, which means 2 milliseconds after the waveform goes above that threshold, that's when the compression comes in. That is basically instantaneous. So you can imagine that this purple line is there representing attack. But if I was to increase the attack, that means that the compressor sort of waits for a little bit after it goes above the threshold before it starts adding that compression. This is particularly good for if you want to compress drums altogether but still have that initial transient sort of cut through the mix. The initial hit from the kick and snare, you can leave them unaffected by having a slightly slower attack time. And if you sort of compare what that sounds like, that's with a very fast attack. You can hear it sounds kind of dull. It's really squashing that kick and that snare. And then as I slow down the attack and it lets through more of that initial hit, it sounds kind of snappier because you're not compressing that first hit, you're letting it come through. Finally, we're going to talk about release. Release is basically the opposite of attack. So that is, how long will it keep compressing the signal for after it falls below the threshold again? So this all varies based on what sound you want to achieve, but generally on drums, you want a short release time so that each hit is being compressed individually. If I was to increase this quite dramatically now, you can see that the meter isn't going all the way back to 0 in between each hit, and that's because the compressor keeps working even after it goes below the threshold, so it's actually compressing all the time, it's never going all the way off. That results in a more smooth sound, but for drums it can really take all the life out of them. It's much better used, in my opinion, a slow release time for vocal processing and occasionally on bass, where it'll catch those really heavy peaks that sometimes come from dynamic vocal or bass performances and smooth it out in a more sort of natural sounding way compared to a very fast release time. The final point I just want to say is about makeup gain and auto gain specifically. A lot of compressors, especially like Logic stock compressors, the auto gain will be switched on by default, and I always turn it off. The reason you want to do it that way is that it allows you to hear more accurately what the compressor is actually doing. If you leave the auto gain settings switched on, it has a tendency just to make it way louder. It doesn't really level match very effectively. So then when you turn it off, you think you're hearing the compression, but actually it's just making it louder. And that makes it much more difficult to actually hear what the compressor is doing. So yeah, I think once you can visualize what the compressor is actually doing and how each of these different settings sculpts the sound, it then makes it much easier for you to know what to listen out for, and that's going to improve your mixes. If you want me to go more in detail on anything, like maybe give examples using different instruments or how you would apply it to an actual full track in practice, let me know in the comments and maybe I'll make that for my next video. If you found this useful, drop us a like and a follow. Cheers.